I reached for the edge of the table and my thumb met glass. 14 years of pressing that scar, axe split, pale from knuckle to first joint, into any grain of wood I could find whenever something inside me needed holding down, and the notary's conference table gave me nothing, no grain, no give, no place to anchor what was already rising through my chest before I'd finished reading page 4. Page 4 carried my signature. The loop of the A, the flat cross of the T, close enough to fool a bank teller, close enough to fool the government registry of Nova Scotia. Not close enough to fool the man whose hand it was supposed to belong to. The transfer was filed 3 months ago, the notary said. He sat across from me in a glass-walled office on Barrington Street, Halifax, a February harbor wind rattling the window behind him. Ashcroft Distillery's proprietary formulas and the deed to the Chester Basin property, both registered to a numbered company. 90214 Nova Scotia Limited. I set the document down and squared its edges against the table, carefully, because my hands needed a job that wasn't shaking. I'll need copies of everything, I said. My voice came out level, the voice of a man discussing somebody else's disaster. I didn't ask who had access to my signature. I already had a short list. 6 hours earlier, the distillery still smelled like Tuesday. That's the thing nobody tells you about a craft distillery in its 9th year of operation. It doesn't smell like the glossy magazine spreads, all amber light and artisanal shadow. It smells like wet cardboard from the mash bins, and diesel from the delivery truck idling in the yard, and underneath everything, all the time, the low sweet smoke of peat drying in the kiln shed. That smell had lived in the creases of my hands for so long that I'd stopped noticing it. Other people noticed. Maid used to say she could smell me coming from across a restaurant. She wasn't smelling me that morning. She was in the front office with a suitcase too large for what she'd described as a 2-day trip to Toronto, zipping and rezipping the outer pocket like the zipper itself owed her an apology. "You'll survive without me," she said, not looking up. "I generally do." I meant it lightly. She didn't take it lightly, or she took it exactly the way she'd decided to take everything lately, which was as evidence. "Declan's got the Islay barrels moving to the second rack today," she added, still not looking at me. "He said to tell you not to touch the hydrometer, you always leave it wet." "I always leave it wet on purpose. Keeps the reading honest." That got the ghost of a smile out of her, quick as a struck match, gone before it caught. 19 years I'd known that smile. I'd have sworn on the deed to the property, the deed, it turned out, I no longer held, that I still knew what it meant. I carried her suitcase to the car myself. She kissed my cheek at the door, a dry, correct kiss, the kind you'd give a cousin. I told myself it was the cold. Declan was down in the aging cellar when I found him, headlamp throwing a cone of white across the number 3 rick, tasting notebook open on a barrel head. 21 years since university, and I still felt something loosen in my chest every time I came down those stone steps and saw him working. That hunch of his shoulders I could have drawn from memory, the way he held a glass up to the light like he was reading a doctor's chart instead of judging color. "Come smell this," he said, not turning around. "Batch 11's doing something strange in the finish. Might be the chara level." I bent over the glass he offered. "Vanilla first, then something darker underneath, almost medicinal." "Iodine," I said. "That's what I thought." "That's not us." He said it the way he always did, a man catching a flaw before anyone else could, proof he was still the sharpest palate in the building, in the province, in whatever room he happened to be standing in. Declan had built half the reputation Ashcroft Distillery carried on his tongue and his notebooks, and everyone who mattered in the industry knew it, even if the label on the bottle said my name and my face and my father's old farmhouse silhouette. He'd never once complained to me about that. He didn't need to. I saw it in the way he corrected journalists. "Actually, the recipe's mine, Aldous just signs the checks," with a laugh that landed a half-second too hard to be entirely a joke. "Audit's Thursday," I said, mostly to fill the space. "Full asset review, insurance wants it before we finalize the expansion loan." Something crossed his face, there and gone, the way a cloud passes over water and the water doesn't remember it. "Should be clean," he said. I haven't touched the books. I hadn't asked whether he had. Before I climbed back up the stone steps, I unhooked the aging seller's spare key from my belt ring and set it on the barrelhead beside his notebook. Habit. He'd need it if I was in Halifax all week for the loan meetings, and there was no version of the last 2 decades in which I'd have thought twice about it. I didn't think twice about it now, either. That's worth remembering, later, when I tell you how carefully I started watching him. It was the security company that finally told me what I didn't want to hear, and they told me almost by accident. I'd called Halifax Digital Safeguard about an unrelated glitch, a delivery notification that hadn't fired the week before, and the technician, a young guy named Priyansh with the over-explaining habit of someone new to customer calls, pulled up my account and started walking me through the log. "Everything looks normal since July 1st, he said. That's when the asset monitoring suite got reactivated. Before that there's just nothing. 6 months of nothing. Was that intentional, sir?" I sat very still at my desk. My office was one of the few rooms in the building with its original wood, a heavy oak partner's desk that had belonged to my father, edges gone soft and dark with 40 years of hands. I found the corner of it without thinking and pressed my thumb along the grain, the scar catching slightly on a groove worn smooth by 3 generations of Ashcrofts leaning on their elbows and worrying about money. "Who reactivated it?" I said. "On July 1st. Says here, the primary account holder." "That's you, sir." "And who disabled it?" 6 months before that." A pause, keys clicking. "Same. Account holder credentials, disabled remotely. January 8th. January 8th. I knew the date the way you know your own pulse, without needing to check it. January 8th was the day my father's heart, weakened by 3 strokes and 40 years of hard cider and harder winters, had finally quit doing its one job, and I had been sitting in a windowless ICU corridor at the QEII Health Sciences Center in Halifax when it happened, unshaven, running on vending machine coffee, having handed my phone, my passwords, my security tokens, and every operational key to the only 2 people I trusted enough not to think twice about it. Maeve. Declan. "Sir? You still there?" "I'm here." I thanked him. I hung up. I sat in the wooden chair that had held 3 generations of Ashcroft men, and I did not move for a long time, one thumb pressed hard against the smooth-worn edge of the desk, feeling the old scar catch and release, like something trying and failing to speak. Thursday's audit would show the numbers. It wouldn't show me the truth, and I already understood, sitting there in the gathering dark with the smell of peat smoke rising off my own hands, that the truth was the only thing I actually wanted anymore. I heard the front door of the office building open below. Maeve's flight must have landed early, or Declan had come up from the cellar for supper, or both, their voices low and easy in the front hall the way they'd always been, the way I'd never once in 20 years thought to question. I stood, straightened my collar, and practiced, silently, a smile that gave nothing away. If they wanted to play at not knowing me, I was going to become very good at not knowing them back. I started small. A locked desk drawer, an old laptop, the kind of quiet, patient-looking a man does at 2 in the morning when he's told his wife he's checking on the mash tuns. The message was on Maeve's old iCloud backup, synced years ago to a shared family drive neither of us had opened since we digitized our wedding photos. Sent to her sister Fiona, dated the 2nd week of January, 4 days after my father's funeral. He's going to bury himself in that distillery for another 20 years and call it grief. I married a man, not a mash tun. Taking the thing he loves most isn't cruelty. It's the only currency he understands. Call it a settlement for my 20s. I read it 11 times. I did not throw the laptop. I did not wake her. I sat in the dark of the aging cellar, surrounded by 400 barrels of whiskey that wouldn't be ready to drink for another 6 years, and I put my palm flat against the nearest one until the rough oak bit into my skin, and I let myself feel exactly 1 clean minute of it before I locked the feeling back down where I could use it. Friday night I cooked. Braised short ribs, the recipe from my mother's side, the kind of meal that takes 4 hours and fills a house with a smell that makes people generous. Declan brought a bottle of the 12-year from the good rack without asking, which used to delight me and now told me something else entirely. A man doesn't drink through the good stock unless some part of him has already decided there won't be a 13-year. I've been thinking about Singapore, Declan said, swirling his glass. The distributor there, the one from the trade show. If we scaled the peat line, licensed it out, Ashcroft doesn't license, I said. Easy. Mild, just a fact stated for the 100th time. Maybe it should. Mate didn't look up from her plate. Everything doesn't have to stay small and precious forever, Aldous. Some things are allowed to grow into money instead of just mythology. Mythology pays the mortgage, last I checked. Barely, she said, and there it was, quick, sharp, gone as fast as it came, the same flash I'd seen at the car door. Declan's eyes flicked to her, just once, just a half-second too long to be nothing. I set down my fork. You know what, I said, let's actually talk about it. Real numbers. I'll call Tom Whitfield Monday, get him to run projections on a licensing model. If it pencils out, I'm not married to doing things the hard way just to prove something. I watched them both very carefully when I said it. I wanted to see what an offer of exactly what they claimed to want would do to two people who had already decided not to want it from me at all. Maeve's face did something complicated, a flicker of alarm, quickly smoothed. There's no rush, she said. It was just an idea. Declan reached for the wine bottle instead of answering, which was its own kind of answer. I refilled his glass myself, my hand steady, and thought, there it is. They didn't want my cooperation. My cooperation was inconvenient. Whatever they were building, it required me to stay exactly as blind as I'd been for 6 months, not to suddenly start negotiating in good faith. I went looking for the 6 months itself 2 nights later, because a date isn't a story, and I needed the story. The token logs from Halifax Digital Safeguard were only half of it. The rest lived with our accountant, a careful, humorless man named Rajan Bhatt who'd handled Ashcroft's books since before Maeve and I married, and who picked up on the second ring even though it was after 9. The security override, he said, once I'd explained what I needed. That's not something I can just pull for you over the phone, Aldous. Client confidentiality cuts both ways in a joint account. Rajan. It's my company. It's a joint account with power of attorney provisions your wife holds. Which is exactly the problem, isn't it? A pause, papers rustling on his end. You want to know when your signature was used to authorize the token deactivation. January 8th, 3:11 in the afternoon. 3:11 in the afternoon. I knew where I'd been at 3:11 in the afternoon on January 8th. I'd been standing at a hospital window watching a resident I'd never met before or since walk toward me slowly, the way doctors do when there's no more reason to hurry, and somewhere in the 40 minutes after that, grief had taken the shape of a black hole in my memory, a stretch of time I could not, no matter how I turned it over, actually account for. I remembered Maeve's hand on my back. I remembered Declan's voice, low, saying he'd take care of everything at the distillery, don't worry about a thing, just be here for your dad. I remembered signing something. A dozen somethings. Forms. Insurance. Do not resuscitate confirmations. My hand moving, my eyes not really reading. Somewhere inside that blur, at 3:11 in the afternoon, on the worst day of my life, my signature had also switched off every alarm protecting everything I'd spent 20 years building. Rajan, I said, and my voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. Who was physically holding the device that authorized it? Bet I can't get you without a subpoena, Aldous. I'm sorry. I really am. And he did sound sorry, which was somehow worse than if he hadn't. I hung up and sat in the dark kitchen a long time, the refrigerator humming, the whole house asleep above me, and thought about how a person could stand next to you at the worst moment of your life and use it as cover, and still let you make them dinner 3 days later, and still let you pour their wine. I found the notebook by accident, looking for something else entirely, old insurance paperwork, buried in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet in my father's old study, which I still called my father's study even 9 years after he'd handed me the keys. Pig leather cover, cracked soft at the spine, the color gone from rust brown to something closer to tobacco. Maeve had given it to me the winter after we married, wrapped in brown paper with a ribbon she'd tied herself, badly, 3 separate loops that had come apart in my hands. For the recipes that'll make us rich, she'd written on the inside flap, in handwriting that still, after everything, looked like the handwriting of someone who'd meant it. I opened it and there was Declan's hand, too, alongside mine, going back and forth down the pages the way it always had, his cramped scientific notation for mash bills and fermentation temperatures, my looser scrawl noting how a batch tasted, what memory it called up, what we should name it. Batch 1. 15 years ago. 2 26-year-olds in a rented pole barn with borrowed money and a still date built from a repurposed dairy tank, certain they were about to invent something that mattered. Smells like Dad's tobacco shed, I'd written, next to Declan's note on peat percentage. Call it Ashcroft's first. I sat on the cold floor of the study with the notebook open across my knees and, for one long, dangerous minute, I let myself imagine walking into the kitchen and putting it in front of them both and saying, I know. Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me there's a version of this where we're still the 3 people who wrote this book, and I'll believe you, because God help me, I want to. My thumb found the scar without my telling it to, but there was no wood here to press it against, only the soft, yielding leather of the cover, worn smooth by 15 years of hands. I pressed anyway. The leather gave nothing back, no grain, no resistance, nothing to catch on, and that absence told me something the way the smooth glass table had told me something in the notary's office. Leather forgives nothing. It only looks like it would. I closed the notebook. I did not put it back in the drawer. I folded it into the inside pocket of my jacket, over my heart, where it sat heavier than a book that size had any right to, and I told myself it wasn't sentiment. It was evidence. I needed to believe that more than I needed almost anything else that week. The deadline found me, not the other way around. It was in an email Declan had forgotten to remove from the shared printer queue, an oversight so small, so human, that it almost made me laugh out loud standing there in the empty front office at 6 in the morning. A confirmation from a law firm in Toronto, Whitlock and Sarr, addressed to a Mr. D. Fairweather, subject line, closing, Ashcroft asset transfer, time sensitive. The body of it was short. The Meridian Group's acquisition committee required final signatures within 48 hours to lock in the current valuation before their fiscal quarter closed. Failure to execute by Thursday, 5 o'clock, would require the entire deal to be re-underwritten, a delay Meridian's counsel strongly discouraged, given, the email noted with a coldness that took my breath away, the current owner's apparent unawareness of the transaction status. The current owner's apparent unawareness. They had a name for me, and it wasn't husband, and it wasn't founder, and it wasn't friend. I was a line item. A condition to be managed before 5 o'clock Thursday. I stood in the gray early light with the printout in my hand, my own reflection faint and doubled in the office window, and for the first time since the notary's glass table, I didn't feel the urge to press my thumb against anything at all. Something under the grief had gone very still and very clear, the way the surface of the mashed tun goes still right before the yeast finishes its work and the whole batch turns, all at once, into something else. 48 hours. I picked up my phone and called Declan's cell, and when he answered, sleep still thick in his voice, I said the words as easily as I'd said them 1,000 times before, the way you say the truest lie of your life, light, warm, entirely without weight. Hey. It's early, I know. Listen, I've been thinking about that Singapore idea. I want to sit down, the 3 of us, go over the real numbers properly. Thursday work? Say, 4 o'clock? There was a pause on the line just a half-second too long. Thursdays, yeah, Declan said. Thursday works. Good, I said, and I meant it the way a man means the last word before he closes a door he intends to lock from the outside. I'll see you both there. Thursday came in gray and windless, the whole province holding its breath before a storm nobody had forecast. I chose the tasting room for the meeting, not the front office. It seemed right, the long table we'd built ourselves out of a fallen elm from the property, the shelf of every bottle we'd ever released standing in a row like a family photograph nobody had thought to take down. Maeve arrived first, in the grey wool coat she wore for things she considered serious. Declan came in behind her, 2 minutes late, carrying a leather folio I recognized, because I'd bought it for him myself, 4 Christmases ago. My lawyer, a sharp, unhurried woman named Odalise Ferreira, sat at the far end with a folder of her own. I hadn't told either of them she'd be there. I watched Declan's eyes find her and do the arithmetic. Before we start on Singapore, I said, there's something else on the table today. Maeve's hand went still over her cup of tea. I opened the folder Odalise had prepared and slid it, unhurried, to the center of the elm table. January 8th, I said. 3:11 in the afternoon. I was standing at a window in the ICU at the QEII, watching a doctor walk toward me to tell me my father was gone. At that exact time, my digital signature was used to disable every security alert on this company's accounts, and to transfer power of attorney authority to execute asset transfers without secondary confirmation. I didn't do that. I couldn't have done that. I was somewhere no husband or friend should ever have left me alone. The room was very quiet. Somewhere in the kiln shed a fan cycled on, a low mechanical hum through the wall. Under Nova Scotia law, I went on, and my voice stayed level, stayed the register I'd practiced alone in the car on the way over, a person deemed to be under acute psychological distress, grief, shock, the kind a doctor can put a clinical name to, lacks the capacity to execute binding legal authorizations. Any document signed, or any authority exercised in my name, during that window is void. Not disputable. Void. I looked at Declan. Which means the deed transfer to 900214 Nova Scotia Limited never happened. Which means the Meridian Group's 4 o'clock closing today isn't closing anything. Declan's face didn't fall so much as empty out, a man doing very fast math and not liking any of the sums. Aldous. I know it was you who held the token, I said, not unkindly, which was somehow worse than if I had been. I know you were in the room. I know because you told me you'd take care of everything, and I believed you, because in 20 years you'd never once given me a reason not to. You used the worst afternoon of my life as cover. Both of you did. Not because it was convenient timing. Because it was the only timing that would ever work, the only day I would ever hand you the keys and not watch you use them. Maeve's eyes had gone bright and wet, and for 1/2 second something in my chest still moved toward her, the old animal reflex of 19 years. You cared more about that distillery than you ever cared about me, she said, low. You cared more about a barrel of whiskey than you cared about coming home at night. I didn't take anything from you. I took back the 20 years I gave to a marriage to a man who married a building. Maybe, I said. I won't stand here and tell you that's not partly true. But you didn't leave, Maeve. Leaving was always sitting right there for you, the whole time, free of charge. You waited for the 1 week I couldn't watch the door, and then you didn't leave. You took. She didn't have an answer for that. Nobody in the room did. Odalise slid the second document across, the injunction, already filed that morning, freezing all assets of the numbered company pending the fraud investigation Halifax Regional Police had opened at 9 a.m. that day, on evidence that traced the shell company's incorporation directly to an account in Declan's name. Meridian's own counsel, informed an hour earlier by courtesy call, had already withdrawn from the closing. A company that size did not stay within a mile of a fraud investigation, not for a peaked whiskey brand, not for anything. Declan set his leather folio down on the table, very carefully, like something he no longer trusted himself to hold. He didn't reach for the document. He didn't argue the numbers. There was nothing left in the room to argue with. For what it's worth, he said finally, not looking at me, the whiskey really was good. I never lied about that part. I know, I said. And I did know, and it didn't change one single thing. They were gone within the hour, Maeve to her sisters in Dartmouth, Declan to wherever men go when the room they built their whole reputation inside no longer has a door that opens for them. Odalise left last, squeezing my shoulder once on her way out without a word. I stood alone in the tasting room as the light went from gray to the deeper gray that passes for evening in February, and I found I didn't feel the thing I'd expected to feel. Not triumph. Not even relief, exactly. Just a kind of enormous, ringing quiet, the sound a room makes after a long piece of machinery finally shuts off. I was clearing the table, Maeve's cold tea, Declan's water glass, the folio he'd left behind without seeming to notice, when the notebook slid out of my jacket's inside pocket and hit the floor with a soft, flat sound, splayed open near the leg of the elm table, pig leather cover face down, pages fanned. I hadn't meant to bring it. I'd carried it every day for a week without letting myself think about why. I crouched and picked it up. The room was cold now, the kiln shed's fan long since cycled off, and my hand found the familiar shape of the cover in the dark almost without looking, worn smooth at the corners, the ribbon Maeve had tied still knotted crooked around the spine after 15 years, because none of us had ever had the heart to retie it properly. My thumb went, out of old habit, to the scar, and pressed. The leather gave nothing back. It never had. It only ever looked like it would. I carried it across the room to the wood stove in the corner, the one we'd always fed with the offcuts and broken staves from the cooperage, oak scraps too split or too small to hold whiskey, good for nothing now but heat. I opened the iron door. The coals inside were still orange, breathing faintly in the draft. I didn't read it again. I didn't need to. I knew every page of it the way I knew the back of my own hand, the scar included, and that was exactly the problem. It was a book written by 3 people who no longer existed, in the handwriting of 2 men who no longer existed either, no matter how much of their names I still shared. I put it in. The leather caught slow, then all at once, curling black at the edges before the flame found the pages underneath, and for a moment the room filled with a new smell laid over the old one, hot leather, burning paper, the faintly sweet char of very old ink letting go, and it moved through the air until it reached the place where it had always lived without my noticing. The deep, permanent smoke smell worked into the creases of my own hands, until for the first time in 15 years I couldn't tell, standing there in the dark with my palm still faintly warm from the stove door, which smoke was the fire's and which had been mine all along. I stayed by the stove until the last page had folded into ash and the iron door had gone from orange to a duller red, and then I did what I always did at the end of a long night in that building. I walked the floor, checking latches, the way my father had taught me before I was old enough to reach them without a stool. The rick room was quiet, 400 barrels breathing slow in the dark. I ran my hand along the third rack out of habit, and the wood there was rough where the elm tables had been smooth, coarse where the notebook's cover had given nothing back, and for the first time since the notary's office I felt my thumb catch on something real, a splinter of grain along a stave, not a scar looking for a place to hide, just oak being oak, holding what it held without asking who'd filled it or why. I stood there a long time, palm flat against the barrel, feeling the building settle around me in the dark, the tick of cooling metal in the kiln shed, the faint creak of roof trusses adjusting to the cold. Ashcroft's first was still in there somewhere, one of the original barrels from the pole barn days, marked in Declan's cramped hand on a tag gone brittle and pale. I left it where it was. Whatever was inside it now belonged to time, not to either of us. I locked the rick room, one turn of the key, the way I'd always done it, and went upstairs. The tasting room window had fogged over during the meeting, and I cracked it an inch. February harbor air came through in a long, clean draft, pushing out the last of the burnt leather, the last of the afternoon, until the room carried nothing but salt and cold and the peat smoke that lived in the walls themselves. I turned off the lights. My hands still smelled like peat and wet oak when I stepped outside. They smelled like that every night. They'd smell like that tomorrow.